Greetings everyone. Welcome to the ongoing series on inequality and difference. Today I would be discussing colonial policy towards pastoral nomads and tribal groups. So basically we are taking one by one several categories that can be discussed under the theme of inequality. I have already covered the aspect of caste, and today we would be talking about the pastoral nomads and then also tribals and what was the impact of colonial rules, regulations, policies on their lives. So basically we would be talking about pastoralism as it existed in India, several challenges that pastoralism faced, and what was the impact of colonial ideology and how it brought about a change and it had very negative implications on the lives of pastoral groups. Nomadic pastoralism was prevalent in the drylands of Western India, the Deccan Plateau, and in the mountainous reaches of the Himalayas. However, the nomadic and pastoral groups were not restricted to these areas only, as they were constantly on the move in search of pastures. So, the most numerous pastoral group in the western part of India was Rebari or Raika, and they were predominant in the states of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Haryana. Rebari are known as Raika in the Marwar region of Rajasthan, and this term Raika carries the connotation of a camel breeder. So as you can see on the screen, they had a very specific ecosystem and they catered to the landscape diversity. So camels offered a wide variety of scattered and seasonally variable supplies of product. The camels were able to utilize whatever was locally available, the kind of varieties of tree and grass vegetation, and hence there was a perfect symbiotic relationship between pastoral groups and camels as well as the desert vegetation. Pastoralism had been crucial for several reasons. For example, it helped in maintenance of diversity of different types like wild plant diversity, then domesticated plant diversity, as well as wild animal and domesticated animal diversity. Then it also promoted landscape diversity and it was conducive to the available ecosystem. It also helped in maintenance of nutritional diversity. However, what emerged from the colonial period onwards was some kind of a tussle between the people and the resources, a tussle between the colonial state and the resources. The unjust tribal predicament in India existed both in pre as well as post independence times. So, while there was a subsistence non-accumulated economy which largely catered to the needs of these pastoral groups, and they were used to living in small communities tightly knit by kinship and labor pooling customs. However, things started changing as civilization made inroads into their habitat. They were fierce defenders of their resources, resource bases, which were crucial to their livelihoods and day-to-day existence. They were largely non-literate song and dance based cultures, and also their culture or social structure was largely patriarchal. However, when we are talking about impact of colonial policy in tribal areas, a lot began to change with the creation of forest department in search of timber which was needed for several colonial projects like shipbuilding, sleepers that had to be developed for railway lines, several construction activities, etc. Extension of settled agriculture to enhance land revenue was also one of the very important factors. So the introduction of zamindari or malguzari as well as rayatwadi land settlements definitely had an impact on the areas that were largely inhabited by these marginalized groups. So with the introduction of non-Adivasi settler communities in the regions that were largely tribal areas, all this was being done to facilitate colonial administration in order to facilitate revenue collection as a result of the new land revenue policies that were introduced from 1793 onwards. As a result, tribals and nomadic groups were pushed out from their original homes, also from the plains areas into the more inaccessible and inhabitable upper watersheds as well as hilly regions. So this was a major change that came about as far as their habitat location was concerned. However, tribals fought back valiantly several times against this injustice. Promotion of Adivasi difference as a counter to the movement for national independence also needs to be taken into consideration. Now, since these tribals and nomads, they were accustomed to seasonal activities and especially the pastoral groups. For example, in this visual you can see that Gaddi's sheep was being sheared, and this was one activity that was limited to specific months of the year. So it was not as if like cultivation they would be engaged in agriculture throughout the year. Their activities were largely seasonal. Then similarly, you can see how Rebari, Raika, Devasi, they were largely dependent on camels and availability of pastures for their sustenance was very important. Now in this map you can see the areas that were inhabited by the tribal groups around 19th century. So this was primarily the period when colonialism was making inroads, and how gradually after one area to another the different territories of Indian subcontinent were being occupied by the colonial administrators and their rules and regulations were being enforced. So this map clearly gives you an idea of how widespread these groups were at one point of time and how they later on shrunk to a very limited and restricted habitat that was made available to them, and that too in very inhospitable terrain. So what emerged as a result of this colonial expansion was emergence of zones of conflict, which again prove that how colonialism was conflicting with the interests of indigenous elements. So therefore, we must understand that how colonial administrators described tribals in the colonial discourse. So it was used to differentiate, the term tribe or tribal was used to differentiate groups that in the government's observation or understanding did not follow Hindu caste rules. So anyone who was not following caste rules and Brahmanical rules and regulations was kind of described as tribal and an exceptional category. and this covered a range of unrelated communities, pastoral nomads, settled Afghans, forest dwellers, etc. And a range of values were also ascribed to each of these, though most of these traits or values were mutually contradictory. So, the racial bias which the colonial administrators had and which they had cultivated over a period of time got further reinforced. Most of these pastoral nomads were very particular and specific about seasonal movement. So, for example, Gujjar Bakarwals belonging to Jammu and Kashmir, during the winter season they used to move towards the low hills of Shivalik and they used to move upwards in summers. Similarly, Gaddi shepherds belonging to Himachal Pradesh, they used to descend down into the lower hills of Shivalik in winters and migrated to Lahore and Spiti during summers. And as you can see in some of these visuals, that how these Maldhari herders were moving constantly in search of pastures. So, they were not used to living at one place like settled agricultural communities. So, because of these traits, specific values or stereotypes came to be associated with tribal groups and they are visible in several colonial writings of the time. So, the colonial administrators considered them as completely different and cut off from caste society in terms of their mobility as well as lifestyle. An imagined historical or social description that was devised to explain such groups was the use of the term aboriginal as well as barbaric, which again is visible in most of the contemporary records. So, this was how these groups were described, and by early 19th century they came to be seen as troublemakers. Why as troublemakers? Because they were described as raiders, bandits, and some of them were even labeled as belonging to criminal castes and tribes. So, this kind of categorization became all the more visible once census exercise began, and there were several categories for each caste, and the entire concept of branding particular castes or jatis with specific traits became the norm of the day. So, a very important activity of these pastoral groups, that was migration, seasonal migration, constant movement, came to be looked down upon as the harbinger of everything that was going to be wrong with them, and they came to be seen as creators of utter lawlessness and disregard to rules and regulations that had been laid by the administration. So, their constant movement from one place to another was perceived as a constant threat by the colonial administrators, who were used to the idea of settled communities, settled agricultural communities, who would be all the time working in the fields and working to fill the coffers of the colonial treasury. Now, what exactly generated this kind of view, this kind of suspicion? So, there were prejudices that were associated with the mobility of these groups, as it was a threat to colonial ideas of law and order. Okay, and colonial administrators were very particular about sealing of borderlands, and this sealing of borderlands could not happen till the time there were these communities who were always on the move along with their cattle. So, these racial prejudices towards the unsettled communities were definitely playing their role in creating a very inconducive and hostile administrative setup that was just not suitable for the lifestyles of these marginalized groups. In addition to that, one can also point out the impact of Protestant or evangelical notions of productivity and utilitarianism, which viewed tribal mode of production as wasteful and primitive. So, according to utilitarian ideology, what was more useful? A more useful community was one which was all the time indulging in some productive activity, and they were not whiling away their time, and they were doing some productive work which would be leading to enrichment of the state. Okay, so the nomads and the forest dwellers, who were very hard to tax because they were always on the move, and they were not really producing something which could be perceived as an important produce by the colonial administrators in the form of crops or commercial crops, to be specific. So therefore these kind of notions came to influence colonial mindset all the more. So this very notion that these groups were good for nothing. Why? Because they were difficult to tax. So for example, the Gujars would climb high mountains during the summer months. So they were just not available. That community would be absent during several months of the year. So obviously their whereabouts were not to be known, and it was difficult for colonial administrators to tap their movement. So in order to curb this kind of seasonal movement, there was a system that was put in place. Now, Britishers also had a concept of the historical scale of civilization. Now, this idea was largely created by Whig view of history, that historical development is a constant process towards human betterment. So, the concept of human evolution, that humans have evolved from different stages, and in this view human civilization moves from primitive activity such as hunting and gathering to settled agriculture to industrialized production. So these were the three stages that were clearly demarcated, and the colonial administrators strongly believed in this historical scale of civilization, and they took it upon themselves to transform India from this primitive activity stage of hunting and food gathering wherever it was still visible, to settled agriculture and also industrialized production, but with lots of limits, keeping in view the benefits that they could accrue from any kind of expansion in India, because for them what was most important was industrialization that was going on in England, and how they could benefit out of the mass market of British manufactured goods in a colony like India. So the societies that do not exhibit this kind of forward trend, that is transition from hunting to agriculture to industries, they were termed as backward. So they had the colonial administrators had no notion of ecological specialization, and as I just discussed at the beginning of the lecture, that what was the advantage of pastoralism? They were adding to diversity. They were adding to diversity of wildlife, plant life, domesticated plants and animals, as well as nutrition. But all these were the aspects that were neglected by the Britishers. So they stressed Western use of land, religious beliefs, acquisition of wealth as a measure of civilization, which was not displayed by tribals. So the problem of mobility for colonialists was considered as very grave, and especially in the regions like in the northwest, Afghan, Lohani and other groups, cross borders that were considered unsecure and dangerous. There were also concerns about spying, issue of Central Asian rivalry with Afghanistan as well as Russia, due to which Britishers were very suspicious of the movements of these groups in these areas. In central and western India, tribal groups were accused of raiding and they were seen as hardened criminals. In fact, most of these nomads and pastoral groups were categorized as criminals, and in fact their physical features, their facial characteristics were also described in detail so as to help the police department. Then there was the issue of slash and burn agriculture that was rampant in central and northeastern India. Now, this kind of agriculture was seen as wasteful because it was depleting timber, and the British administration was not ready to sacrifice timber, which was such an important resource for them, which they needed for railways, which they needed for construction activities, etc. So we see how several racial prejudices were playing an important role, and by 19th century a scientific discourse of race also had been devised, and the tribal groups were placed at the bottom of the new hierarchy of Europeans as well as Asians. Now, there were several new disciplines such as anthropology that used the so-called scientific methods to support such ideas. New literature, live exhibitions of such groups further popularized their theories, and definitely there was use of colonial photography to show how these groups needed colonial help, and they must shift to a more workable lifestyle. So the ideas of idleness and productivity definitely played an important role, and the colonial administration ascribed moral values to hard work such as farming and factory labor versus the idle occupations such as hunting and gathering or even herding. So the stereotype of lazy tribals, emphasis in literature about their leisure activities like dancing, drinking, gambling, etc. Made inroads, and these stereotypes got further strengthened. So the colonial policy of getting maximum output from land, lower extraction of resources by tribal groups was seen largely as a challenge, and various activities like timber, mining, industrial farming conflicted with the tribal hunting and pastoral grounds. So this due to these ideas, the colonial administrators also developed a philosophy of noble savage, and how the tribals, they needed some kind of a help. I would be taking up this issue in one of the next lectures. Thank you.